General Hospital spoilers reveal that Kristina never imagined she would become the axis around which the entire Drew Kane investigation would shift. Yet somehow she found herself pulled into a vortex of control, calculation, and emotional pressure that none of the others in her family were willing to recognize. It began quietly, whispers behind closed doors, files left half open on desks, conversations cut off mid-sentence when she walked into the room. But it soon expanded into a suffocating force pressing down on every part of her life. What she thought was merely a trial designed to identify Drew's shooter had become something far darker, something shaped by agendas she was only now discovering. And as each layer of manipulation peeled back, she realized she was standing in the center of a battle between her mother and her brother, both fighting not just for a legal victory but for control over the narrative, control over their reputations, and control over the truth itself. Every instinct in Kristina's body screamed that a storm was rising, one that would test her in ways she had never been tested before. Alexis had always been the strategist of the family, the one who could turn a courtroom into a battlefield and dismantle opponents with surgical precision. But this time something felt different. Her tactics were more ruthless, more desperate, as if she were trying to rewrite not only the facts of the case but the moral compass that had once guided her. Kristina could see the shift clearly. Alexis was no longer simply arguing the law. She was shaping a reality where Michael could be painted as a man with motive, opportunity, and emotional volatility. She was building a narrative that made sense on paper but felt morally corrosive in a way that deeply unsettled Kristina. It wasn't just legal strategy, it was personal, and Kristina felt her heart tear a little more each time she tried to reconcile the woman she admired with the cold, calculating figure she now saw poring over evidence that cast suspicion on her own son. It was the beginning of the control dynamic tightening around Kristina, forcing her to see her mother through eyes she had never used before. Michael, on the other hand, was unraveling slowly and painfully under the weight of Alexis's accusations. He was carrying secrets, guilt, and anger that made him unpredictable, volatile, and prone to emotional outbursts he no longer tried to hide. The trial had cracked something inside him, something raw and dangerous, and every step he took seemed to be guided by a mix of fear and vengeance. Kristina could see how deeply he resented Willow, how bitterly he carried the betrayal he believed she had inflicted on him and their children. But even underneath that bitterness, Kristina recognized a vulnerability that frightened her. Michael was not just fighting to clear his name. He was fighting to hold together the pieces of a life that had slipped through his fingers. And now that Alexis was aiming the full force of her legal expertise at him, he had become the perfect target, cornered, wounded, and desperate. Kristina knew that if someone didn't intervene, Michael would collapse under the pressure or lash out in a way that would destroy him completely. Trapped between these two gravitational forces, Alexis's cold strategy and Michael's emotional implosion, Kristina became the unwilling fulcrum of a dangerous power shift. She discovered the truth in fragments, documents Alexis was hiding from the family, inconsistencies in the evidence she was preparing, and the unmistakable intention to use both Michael and Jacinda as shields against the possibility that Willow might be implicated in the shooting. It was a revelation that shattered everything Kristina believed about her mother's integrity. She felt betrayed, manipulated, and suddenly aware that she was not just a daughter. She was a pawn in a much larger game. The world around her tilted, forcing her into a role she had never wanted but could no longer avoid. She understood that her silence would make her complicit, and Kristina Corinthos Davis had never been someone who could stay silent while the people she cared about were being harmed. The idea that she might have to stand against her mother began as a whisper in her mind. She tried to ignore, tried to rationalize away, but over time it grew into something undeniable. Every moment she spent watching Alexis prepare to dissect Michael's testimony, every time she witnessed Jacinda's growing terror at being dragged deeper into the investigation, brought her closer to a painful truth. Her mother's version of justice was not justice at all. It was self-preservation disguised as righteousness. And Kristina, caught in the crossfire, felt the first true surge of defiance rise inside her. She had spent her life fighting for causes she believed in, for people who had no power, for communities that were ignored or dismissed. Now, for the first time, the cause was her own family, even if it required her to fracture that family to protect the ones who deserved protection. Jacinda's involvement added another layer of pressure. Kristina saw the fear in her eyes, the silent plea for help that grew stronger with each passing day. Jacinda had never intended to become part of the case, yet she had been pulled into it inadvertently, entangled in Michael's desperation to shield Willow, and in Alexis's determination to twist testimonies to fit her narrative. Kristina watched her become collateral damage. Someone the prosecution and defense were both willing to sacrifice if it meant securing a victory. And the more Kristina saw Jacinda unravel, the more fiercely protective she became. She felt responsible, not because she had caused the chaos, but because she was perhaps the only person in the family who saw Jacinda as a human being, rather than a strategic risk. Protecting Jacinda became a moral obligation, one that solidified Kristina's emerging resolve to oppose her mother if necessary. As the trial intensified, the emotional landscape around Kristina shifted into something jagged and unpredictable. Whispered conversations followed her through every corridor. Tension seeped into every family gathering. Even Sonny observed her with a wary eye, sensing the war brewing beneath her calm exterior. But what none of them realized was that Kristina was going through her own internal reckoning, one that had nothing to do with the courtroom and everything to do with control. The control she had always ceded to her mother. The control she had always allowed others to exert over her narrative. For the first time in her life, she felt herself stepping into a power she had never recognized before. One forged from anger, clarity, and moral certainty. She no longer needed approval. She no longer needed validation. She needed truth, and she needed to protect those who were being crushed by the lies surrounding them. The deeper Kristina fell into the center of the storm, the more she realized how alone she truly was in her perspective. Everyone else had chosen a side. Alexis had chosen strategy. Michael had chosen rage. Willow had chosen silence. Jacinda had chosen survival. But Kristina, by refusing to blindly align herself with her mother, had chosen something far more dangerous: autonomy. She was becoming the variable no one could predict, the element that could destabilize every carefully crafted argument in the courtroom. And that realization gave her a strange, unsettling sense of power. She understood that the moment she acted publicly or privately, inside or outside the courtroom, the entire case would shift. Evidence, alliances, accusations, all of it could change depending on what she decided. Her heart ached at the thought of defying Alexis, the woman who had raised her, fought for her, and shaped her. But the woman Alexis was now the woman who would destroy her own son to win a case. Was not the mother Kristina believed in. She felt a sharp grief mixed with the determination hardening inside her, because choosing to protect Michael and Jacinda meant choosing to wound her mother. And yet, she could no longer pretend that Alexis's pursuit of justice was rooted in truth. It wasn't. It was rooted in fear of losing, fear of being wrong, fear of letting the world see the cracks in her armor. Kristina had reached a breaking point, and when she broke, she did not shatter. She sharpened. The moment she decided to intervene, everything shifted. She would protect Michael. She would protect Jacinda. She would stop Alexis from manipulating the trial into a weapon. And she would do it knowing full well that the price might be permanent damage to her relationship with her mother. But the truth was clear to her now. Sometimes loyalty is not about standing with someone, sometimes it is about standing against them, when their actions threaten to destroy everything and everyone around them. Kristina had stepped into a new role, one she never expected to play, but one she now embraced with fierce clarity. She would be the reckoning. Kristina Corinthos Davis could feel the shift long before anyone spoke it aloud. A slow tightening in the air around her that carried the unmistakable weight of a storm rising. A storm that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the battle forming between her mother and her brother inside the courtroom walls. It was the kind of pressure that crawled beneath the skin. The kind that whispered that something irreversible was about to happen. Something that would force her to choose sides in a way she never imagined. Something that would fracture her sense of loyalty and identity in ways she was not prepared to confront. For days she had been trying to make sense of the patterns she saw emerging. Alexis adjusting her strategy with unnerving precision. Michael growing more volatile with each passing hour. Jacinda dissolving beneath the weight of secrets she never meant to carry. And through it all, Kristina found herself pulled deeper into the center of a narrative that had begun to twist and mutate into something dangerous, something out of control, something she now realized she could no longer ignore. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that her mother's case was not simply aggressive, it was predatory. Alexis's subtle recalibrations were happening faster now. Small adjustments that turned into major accusations. Quiet observations that evolved into full-blown theories designed to dismantle Michael's credibility and push him toward the role of suspect rather than witness. Kristina had always admired her mother's brilliance in the courtroom, admired her strategic mind and ability to see legal pathways others missed. But for the first time she saw something colder behind the arguments, something that made her stomach twist, a willingness to let Michael become collateral damage, if it meant protecting Willow's narrative. A willingness to ignore the emotional devastation her strategy would cause, as long as the final verdict aligned with the version of justice she had constructed. It was a type of control Kristina had never seen so clearly before, and once she recognized it, she couldn't unsee it. Michael, meanwhile, was spiraling. She had watched him deteriorate across the last few weeks, watched him shift from anger to bitterness to something sharper, something fueled by betrayal and humiliation and the unforgiving frustration of feeling unheard. The news that he would be called to testify had only accelerated his unraveling. Sunny had tried to calm him, tried to guide him toward restraint. But Michael had become a man driven by emotional compulsion rather than logic. A man who wanted Willow to feel every wound she had inflicted. A man who had transformed pain into purpose. He wasn't thinking about strategy or optics. He wasn't thinking about how Turner could twist his anger into motive. He wanted revenge. And Kristina could see it burning behind his eyes like a fuse waiting for ignition. The moment he stepped onto that witness stand, he would willingly hand Alexis everything she needed to convince the court and the public that he had every reason to target Drew, that he had every reason to lie, every reason to cover, every reason to lose control. And Kristina knew that once Michael crossed the line, there would be no way back. His anger would become the narrative. His rage would become evidence. His pain would become motive. And Alexis, brilliant, relentless Alexis, would use it without hesitation. Jacinda was breaking too, but in a different way. Kristina could see the fear eating her alive, could see how the pressure of being caught between truth and survival had drained her piece by piece. Jacinda had become trapped in a web she never intended to step into. A web spun by Michael's desperation to shield Willow and strengthened by Alexis's growing suspicion. That Jacinda's timeline didn't quite add up. Every year brought another wave of fear. Fear of being discovered, fear of being exposed, fear of being accused of lying to the police or lying under oath. And Kristina could see the collapse forming inside her, could see the moment approaching when Jacinda would crack from the pressure and destroy herself without meaning to. It was why Kristina's instincts surged with urgency, why she found herself thinking thoughts she never imagined thoughts, like getting Jacinda out of town, removing her from the prosecution's reach, protecting her from the inevitable implosion that Alexis's strategy was designed to trigger. Kristina didn't want Jacinda to run, but she knew that staying would destroy her. And the preview confirmed what her instincts had been screaming, Kristina urging Jacinda to leave. Kristina stepping into a role she never wanted, but suddenly understood she had no choice but to embrace. It was the first true sign that Kristina was no longer simply reacting, she was beginning to act. And that terrified her as much as it empowered her, because she had spent so much of her life letting others decide what battles she fought, letting others shape her choices, letting others stand at the center of conflict while she hovered on the edges. But now she was stepping into the center with purpose, with determination, with fire. And every move she made felt like a rebellion. Every choice felt like a fracture opening between her and Alexis. And every instinct she followed reminded her that siding with Michael and Jacinda meant standing openly against the woman who raised her. That truth burned through her, carving a path she did not know how to avoid. Alexis had always been the force Kristina measured herself against, the brilliant mother who held the moral high ground. The woman whose strength had shaped Kristina's entire understanding of what a powerful woman looked like. But now that strength had become a blade, sharp and pointed, slicing through the family without hesitation. And Kristina could see how deeply Alexis resented losing control over the narrative, over Michael, over Jacinda, and now over her daughter. Every moment Kristina acted independently. Every moment she protected someone Alexis intended to expose. Every moment she disrupted her mother's momentum. The dynamic between them twisted tighter and tighter. Alexis had always expected emotional compliance from Kristina, not obedience, but trust. The kind of trust that made Kristina assume Alexis was always right. But now Kristina could see that Alexis had crossed a moral line, and she knew that remaining silent would make her complicit. The tension between them grew into something palpable, something thick enough to feel in the air. Alexis could sense the shift too. She could feel her grip on the case and on her daughter loosening in ways she had never experienced before. And she recognized the thread forming behind Kristina's eyes. Not anger, not rebellion. Certainty. Certainty that Alexis was wrong. Certainty that Michael needed protection. Certainty that Jacinda was in danger. Certainty that the justice system was about to consume the wrong people. And certainty that she, Kristina, would not let it happen. Kristina had reached a breaking point she didn't even know existed. And once she broke, she didn't fall apart, she sharpened into something new, something fierce. Something Alexis had never prepared for. She no longer cared about pleasing her mother. She no longer feared disappointing her. She no longer felt obligated to stand behind her. She understood now that the cost of loyalty could be moral collapse, and she refused to collapse. She refused to let Michael walk into a courtroom alone. She refused to let Jacinda become a scapegoat. She refused to let Alexis shape the truth into something convenient rather than accurate. And that was when Kristina truly became a threat, not just to Alexis's strategy, but to the entire structure of the case. Because she held information. She held powerful emotional influence over Michael. She held the ability to sway Jacinda. She held the capacity to expose inconsistencies in the timeline that Alexis didn't want questioned. She held the keys to shifting public perception. And Alexis knew it. The more Kristina acted, the more Alexis found herself pushed into a corner, forced to defend a strategy that was already beginning to look unstable. And the more Alexis pushed back, the more determined Kristina became. It was a collision course. A mother and daughter barreling toward a confrontation that neither could avoid, and neither could win without losing something essential. The entire story was tilting toward chaos, toward revelation, toward consequences none of them were ready for, and at the center of that tilt stood Kristina, finally awake, finally aware, finally ready to challenge not just the legal machine but her own mother. And Alexis, for the first time in a very long time, was afraid. Because Kristina was no longer the daughter who sought approval. She was now the catalyst. She was now the disruption. She was now the danger. She was now the one who could bring the entire case crashing down. And nothing, not loyalty, not love, not fear would stop what she was about to do. The destruction of Alexis did not arrive in one dramatic blow but in a slow, suffocating collapse that began the moment the truth about Rick surfaced, first as a whisper, then as an undeniable storm that tore through every fragile bond she had left with her daughters. The revelation that Rick had been held captive in the basement of her own home, hidden behind carefully constructed lies and moral sermons, detonated like a bomb at the center of the Davis family. For years, Alexis had crafted an image of herself as the unwavering guardian of justice, the woman who walked the line between compassion and righteousness, the mother who would always choose truth over convenience. But now that image cracked open, revealing a darkness none of her children were prepared to confront. The moment Molly learned the truth, something inside her shattered permanently. The fury that rose in her was not just anger but heartbreak turned violent. The unbearable realization that the mother she had trusted more than anyone had concealed a secret, so monstrous, so morally unthinkable, that it rewrote her entire childhood in an instant. Molly lunged at Alexis with a storm of accusations, her voice trembling with disbelief, her hands shaking as though she could physically tear apart the narrative Alexis had fed her. For so many years, she screamed about betrayal, about hypocrisy, about the nights Alexis had lectured her about integrity, while a kidnapped man lay hidden beneath their feet. Every memory Molly had ever relied on to define her mother suddenly felt tainted, twisted by the possibility that Alexis had always been capable of deception on a level none of them had imagined. Kristina, already drowning in emotional turmoil because of the war between Alexis and Michael over the Drew shooting, felt the revelation rip through her chest like a blade. She had been struggling to reconcile her mother's courtroom strategies with her own moral compass, fighting internally about whether to protect her brother or support Alexis's version of justice. But this truth about Rick destroyed whatever fragile balance remained. For Kristina, the basement secret was not just a crime. It was a psychological earthquake that shook the foundation of her identity. She remembered every time Alexis had dismissed her feelings, every moment her mother had insisted on being the moral authority, every lecture about responsibility and truth. Now, all of it felt like a manipulation, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to distract everyone from the rot that Alexis herself had allowed to fester. As Kristina looked at her mother, she no longer saw strength or wisdom. She saw a woman who would rewrite morality to suit her needs, a woman who would bury a man alive in silence and then stand in a courtroom speaking about justice with pristine certainty. The betrayal hollowed her out, leaving behind a sharp, cold resolve she had never felt before. This was no longer about the trial, no longer about Michael or Willow or Drew. This was about the person she had trusted most becoming the person she now feared might be capable of anything. Sam, who had always been the quiet center of the Davis family storms, felt the truth unravel her in ways she didn't know how to articulate. She had spent her entire life watching Alexis navigate impossible situations with dignity, believing that even when her mother was flawed, her intentions were pure. But now Sam felt every belief she held crumbling beneath her. She remembered Rick's impact on her life, the trauma, the danger, the scars he left behind. Learning he had been captured and imprisoned by Alexis did not feel like justice. It felt like madness. It felt like Alexis had allowed her own pain to warp into vengeance, so consuming that she crossed a line she could never return from. The memory of her mother comforting her during times of crisis now sickened Sam, because she could no longer separate the nurturing woman from the person capable of chaining Rick in a basement. She wanted to scream, to run, to cry, to hide, but all she could do was stand there, numb and horrified as the truth swallowed the last of her certainty. And in the center of the chaos stood Alexis, watching the three most important people in her life unravel because of choices she thought she could control, choices she thought she could bury beneath intellect and legal brilliance. She saw the shock in Molly's eyes, the disgust in Sam's expression, the cold detachment growing inside Kristina, and for the first time in years, Alexis felt fear, not the fear of consequences, not the fear of exposure, but the fear of losing her daughters forever. She tried to explain, tried to justify, tried to offer context, but every word she spoke felt like another thread snapping between them. There was no version of the truth that could soften what she had done. There was no explanation that could make her actions anything other than monstrous. And the more she tried to regain control, the more she revealed how deeply she had relied on that control to shape their perception of her. The shift happening inside the Davis family was not just emotional, it was seismic. Every argument, every tear, every revelation created aftershocks that shook the household to its core. Molly, previously the daughter who defended Alexis with unwavering devotion, now saw her mother as a stranger who had manipulated her love and loyalty for years. Kristina, who had only recently discovered her strength and independence, felt a surge of clarity she had never known. Clarity that told her that her mother was not the force of morality she pretended to be. And Sam, torn between trauma and logic, felt her trust collapse like a dying star, leaving behind a void where family had once lived. The explosion of truth about Rick was only the beginning of the madness. As the days unfolded, the consequences spread like wildfire. Molly refused to speak to Alexis, locking herself behind doors and refusing to answer calls. Kristina grew colder, more distant, speaking only when necessary, and even then with a restraint that cut deeper than any words could. Sam oscillated between silence and fury, trying to reconcile the impossible, the woman who raised her, and the woman who kept a man imprisoned under their feet. Alexis found herself isolated in her own home, surrounded by people she loved who now looked at her like a threat, a liability, a monster disguised as a mother. And the pressure for once was something she could not outthink or outmaneuver. The psychological shift became uncontrollable. Every attempt to repair from Alexis only made the fractures widen. She had relied on her role as a moral anchor for so long that she never imagined what would happen when that anchor disintegrated. Her daughters no longer saw her as a guide, they saw her as a source of danger. And the most devastating truth for Alexis was this: nothing she did now could erase what she had done then. No victory in court, no apology, no legal justification could restore the trust she had destroyed. The Davis family was entering a new chapter, one defined by betrayal, loss, and a wild, unpredictable recalibration of power that left Alexis on the outside looking in. The change was complete. The explosion was undeniable. And the woman who once held her family together, with sheer force of will, now found herself witnessing the unimaginable. Her daughters uniting not around her, but against her. The legacy of Alexis had collapsed, and nothing would ever be the same again.